second. We are starting the Facebook Live. I hope the sound is good. It's good, it's not too loud, not too high? Okay, perfect. Thanks.
I thought he was starting, but he's not, so we'll talk now. Someone sitting here?
No, it's all mine.
Yeah, because I'm just afraid I'll block the camera.
Yeah, I know.
But I just realized I'm not that tall.
You give a great time in the weekend.
I did.
It was nice. Thank you. Glad that they honored you.
Thank you. And Matt did a beautiful job.
Of course.
It was really nice. And I honored Sana, and I just gave her the presentation. I did a PowerPoint and I did a PDF, and she wanted the text. I got a lot of wonderful people in an email saying how grateful they were that I had done that for Sana.
Okay, we're all here. So thank you guys all for coming. If you haven't had the chance to read our lovely slide for the last 8 minutes, I want to say thank you to all of our exhibition sponsors and our corporate sponsors. The whole point of this year, called 4 Degrees of Separation, was to use Clay Arts Center's gallery and exhibition program as a platform for social activism and finding social connections. So the first show was Me, Myself, and I. It explored identity through vessels. And the show that's up now is called They, which was curated by Roberto. So Roberto is an artist, educator, activist, spoken word poet. He holds an MFA from Penn State University and was the 2015 Emerging Artist for INSECA. He currently teaches at the Tyler School of Art and is represented by Wexler Academy. So thank you and welcome, Roberto.
So I'm introducing our first speaker. So Joan, am I speaking this? Granoil-Thomas is the Executive Director of the Sustainable Portchester Alliance, a coalition of faith, labor, civic education, which are all great things, and individuals committed to responsible development and civic participation in Portchester. She is a 30-year resident of Portchester. Can we, are you coming up to present? All right, let's give Joan a round of applause.
Good afternoon, everyone. Sorry, I looked a little confused. I wasn't quite sure what I was supposed to do, but as Roberto said, I am a close to 30-year resident of Portchester. My husband and I raised our 2 kids here, went through Portchester schools, and I am, thank you, because I like to see you, it was right in my face. And I have a small boutique public relations firm that I run out of my home, and so Portchester is very important to me. And my perspective at this event is to sort of, talk about community and the arts relationship with our community. And I'm going to talk about that through my experience here in Portchester. I've worked with the Clay Arts Center for many years, supporting it. It's a wonderful, wonderful institution, and has tried in many ways to really become a resource to our local population. And that's presented a bit of a problem and a bit of a quandary. And so oftentimes what we know is that art is all around us. Art is in music, art is in architecture, we see art every day. The question becomes, how do we fit art into our lives and go to it and be a part of it? And for many here in Portchester, that's a privilege and a luxury that many just don't have. 63% of the population here in Portchester is Hispanic, 28% is white, 5% is black, and 4% of the remaining percentage is made up of Asian and other ethnicities. Portchester has always been a working class community and continues to be that. And for many of our families, the priorities to go to art? And that has been a question that we have tried to answer for many years. How do we make it so? How do we bring more people into not just Clay Art Center, but any art institution, and have them understand that there is a value to it? And so I'm hoping that in the conversations that we have this afternoon with the other artists and with Roberto, that we can start to understand what that looks like, and understand that there is a balance to that. And we know that certainly there are barriers to entering into the art world and being a part of it and bringing it into your life. But again, as I say, that art is everywhere. And so just to sort of recognize it for what it is and how it influences us is also a very important thing. So I look forward to the discussion that we're about to have, and I thank you all for being here. Thank you.
So excited I get to introduce people. Sana Musasama began traveling as a way to recover identity and cultural place. Yes. Oh, is Lawrence going next? Okay. I see the number 3. All right. I don't know my numbers yet, guys. So, Lawrence Sandler holds an MFA in ceramics from Penn State and undergraduate degree in anthropology and ceramics from Ithaca College and SUNY New Paltz, respectively. Lauren makes her home in upstate New York, where she currently teaches at Skidmore College. Please join me introducing and welcoming Lauren Sandler.
Hello. I have a bit, perhaps more of a talk I put together for you all before we get into the conversation with all of us in a bit. So, let me get my bearings here. I'll figure it out as we go along. So, we're here together today for this symposium in clay. And so I in preparing for this, I'm thinking about that word symposium, and what is a symposium on clay? And what are the set of beliefs and meanings and ideas that we bring to our various understandings of this idea of a symposium? And also, why has the term symposium, come to be part of our lexicon when we come together to share knowledge? So this image that you're seeing here is literally a symposium on clay. And much of what we understand of history, and in this case, that's fine, yeah, of symposium are representations and subsequent interpretations of stories that are told through objects, in this case, on clay. And so symposium from Greek translates to drinking together, and they were institutions of Greek society where elite men were waited on by enslaved men, and they gathered for an evening of poetry and music and conversation, sexual pursuits with female courtesans, and erotic relations between older and younger men. Not the type of symposium that we're participating in today. But I think an essential part of the symposium was the vase in which the wine was served, and the symposium itself was depicted on that, as this shows here. So now, how we're here in Portchester, how do we invoke the symposium? And how do we follow the journey of objects and constructed meanings from multiple cultures and narratives from antiquity to today? And how do we amplify the many stories in the clay to highlight the voices marginalized and the historically underrepresented in institutional spaces? And I think that we do that as teachers and as students and as learners and as makers. We ask who's in the room and who's not in the room. Who tells the story and what stories are being told or not told. And we look for the cultural context to understand the content, and we examine the distribution of narratives through power and the creation of national myths as truth. And we seek the multiple systems of knowledge that are at work concurrently and investigate the lineage of the tale of clay from the earth to the cup in our hands. Let me see if I'm going the right way. I'll talk a little bit about my work and then some other ideas that sort of addressing this idea of myths. And so in my own work, I'm interested in telling stories through fragmented forms, through allegoric containers, mundane assemblages, and much of my work is about investigating mythologies and exploring stories that have been erased or ignored. In a lot of my work, the vessel is often a reference to the body, an individual body, collective bodies, governing bodies, bodies of land, or bodies of evidence. And a lot of my work focuses on two forces coming together, and I think a lot of that comes from my own experience as a product of two cultures, Jewish and Italian. And my work often examines two different perspectives or narratives or forces or ideologies or myths or vessels, in this case, coming together. So this piece is part of a series of mine that I call Bifurcated, in which the vessel as body is a site of historic resistance. And in this series, I'm using different ceramic vessels to depict places of impact and power struggles, and how different systems of control distribute and dominate narratives, or distribute dominant narratives in order to perpetuate authority, really. This piece is called What If the Dandelion Told the Story of Tea, and in it I'm upending classical and traditional tropes as defined by a Eurocentric canon to really call into question the historic use of those terms, classical and traditional. And so instead of representing the classically inspired teacups as occupiers of status and the traditionally built coil pot as something that is static or unchanging, the teacups here, I was imagining them as parasitic as I was building them, trying to take over the formidable coil pot whose walls are bisecting the teacup, and the teacups move in and out of that piece. But the piece is also chronicling these competing narratives in the global history of tea. And so questioning what is myth and what is fact. So through colonization, through trade wars, more forced mass migrations, imperial powers exploited resources such as tea and commodifying it. And so when the narrative is told from the perspective of the colonizer, well, then multiple truths are erased. So for example, the dandelion is not a worthless weed, but the beneficial sucker in dandelion tea. So this work is really highlighting sort of history's distortions, if you will, so that the dandelion, not the teacup, tells the story. So with my current work, a couple of pieces of my current work is in the show at the Clay Art Center right now. I go further into themes of myth building through conjoined chronicles, both personal and historic chronicles. And this series is informed by the Lacanus lidded pots of century-based Sicily that were made from around 300 to 200 BC. This is an example of one of those here. And so with this series, I wanted to examine my own familial histories and cultures to discuss historic narratives and power relationships. And my mother's family is from this area of Sicily. And so as I began to research the works from ancient Rome, I found them to really amplify the multiculturalism of the era. And they really refute the lie that classical antiquity was a homogeneous time and place. So when the objects and statues of antiquity were depicted during the time of the Renaissance era, they were presented as these monochromatic objects, as the image on the left there shows, when they were in fact polychromatic and embellished with silver and inlay and gold and gilding and so on, as the recreation here shows. And so this constructed mythology of these sculptures as white was established and proliferated in the 18th and 19th centuries as a way to equate racial whiteness with beauty. But the reality was that you could be Roman and be Greek or Syrian or Judean or German or Nubian, Ethiopian, Egyptian. And so ancient Rome did not construct difference through the language of race and biology and skin color. The belief that ancient Greeks and Romans are the foundation of a white and Western civilization that belongs to white people is false and is part of a misrepresentation of histories. And this false representation of antiquity and the classics is perpetuated in our classrooms and in our museums and through disciplines of arts and art history. The image on the bottom there is the image on top is a fresco that was found in Pompeii, Sicily, around 50-60 CE. And the image on the bottom, I think, really shows the presence of a multi-ethnic antiquity. It's a Sicilian tombstone inscribed in Latin on the left, Greek on the right, Hebrew on the top, and Arabic on the bottom. So, sorry, wrong way. I have just a couple images of the pieces that I have in the show here, and this is one of them. This is called Centuripe Series Wheat and Wine, and in this I'm referencing wheat, a crop that was tax controlled and sold in the colonies of ancient Greece. The center panel around that object holds wine cups and represents Kiddush cups, the container in Jewish rituals, and the Kiddush cup on the Sicilian-inspired object is an embodiment, as I was talking about before, of my own parental heritages, a conjoining of the two parts of the Italian and Jewish cultures. And this piece, Centuripe Series Salt, which is also in the show today, references salt as a commodity in ancient times, as trade and currency, a material that moves through many different landscapes and cultures. It's a source of power and of protest, of technological advances through preservation and as healing agent. And so this series of mine, the Centuripe series, is really interrogating a Eurocentric art history founded on narratives that are misappropriating earlier histories. And the objects themselves embody migrations and diasporas, the sacred and the everyday, illustrating myths and reality. So this is an image of me doing a raku firing with some students of mine. And so I think about my roles as both an artist and an educator, and what I do is really trying to work to decenter dominant narratives and expose false mythologies in art and art history and education. And as an educator, I consider and really think about the narratives that I'm passing along to my students. I think often ceramics is taught by normalizing a canon of knowledge that is very specific, is a Eurocentric bias with an East Asian focus. It has very specific methodologies and aesthetics that are full and meaningful, and there's so much there to look at and learn from, but when it's presented as the canon, it erases it and it effectively does not see the many people who have and who continue to work with clay. And so there are many cultural contexts of teaching, of learning, of making ceramics, and many systems and knowledge bases through which one can learn. And I think about how we all have our own lived experiences that really shape our perspectives. You know, my own personal life experiences is I'm a lesbian, I have a disabled partner, I live in a rural community that is a third black, a third brown, a third white, with very limited resources. I'm an adjunct with no benefits, little job security. I'm an educator though, and with that I do have resources and access. You know, as a mentor, I think it is my role to utilize my position to ensure that others have access to and can harness knowledge and resources that are available to them. And I think that it's my responsibility to really look at institutional inequities, you know, to question and understand the cultural context, the different meanings they may signify, the power of language in the canon. So if you consider the structure of AP art history, what high school students take it in high school if they're taking AP art history, it's an image set that is 65% from the Western world and 35% the rest of the world. Well, there's clearly a misrepresentation there of the development and practice of art. But I think those statistics are not necessarily surprising when we consider the makeup of teachers in higher education. The National Center for Educational Statistics states that full-time professors are 84% white, 4% black, 3% Latinx, 9% Asian Pacific Islander, and less than 1% Indigenous American. Nearly 90% of recently hired college presidents are white. So I think the idea that higher education provides equity is really a myth. White families without a high school diploma hold more economic wealth than black families with college degrees, as this chart here shows, median wealth by degree and race. And this disparity is built through decades of discrimination in housing and employment and tax laws, loan predation, through disparate allocation of resources in neighborhoods and schools and health and food, through policing, surveillance, criminalization, incarceration. And so these histories of inequity in policy and practice clearly continue today. But I think, you know, how many of us in education, we teach at universities where student debt, generational responsibility, access to health care, personal safety, legal status, all of this can dictate student decisions. And ceramics, often an art form that is devalued, can function as a platform to give voice to those who experience marginalization. And I think that as teachers and as students and as mentors and artists, we can come together from disparate locations at the nexus of art and education. So I think about through the study of ceramics and the elements in our clay, we unearth stories, personal stories, political stories of community, stories of change, and how clay as an archival material, it's a material that remembers and it informs. It speaks to those of us who are not in the room. And clay provides depth and information if we listen and we investigate. So what if the chronicle of clay were told from the perspective of a dandelion or the perspective of cobalt, with transparency from earth to our studios to our table? So this is an image of a cobalt mine. And those of us who work in ceramics might be more familiar with cobalt. It is a very distinctive color and used in ceramics. It appears in the blue and white ware that moves throughout Asia, the Middle East, into Europe. And the journey of this material, well, chronicles global trade, historic and contemporary migrations, old and new imperialisms, and corporate policy and power. The components in our ceramics contains political and personal consequences, content, and context. So today the largest producer of cobalt is actually in the Democratic Republic of Congo, a country that has enormous wealth of natural resources, but people live in great poverty. So cobalt is in our ceramics, but it's also in our batteries that are in our phones, in our computers, in our cars, in drones, in military equipment. And so multinational mining companies accumulate tremendous wealth, profit through the exploitation of individuals, companies, and resources to extract cobalt for our products and for our glazes. And so national myths are often created to maintain power with ideologies of independence, of morality, of progress. But I think ceramics can dispel these myths and expose inequity and articulate our interdependence on one another. So I don't think that we can unsee or unknow or undo the content and the context of cobalt, the labor chain to supply the global demand. And I think that we can look to our elemental clay, the components and constituents, with knowledge and with recognition for information, for discussion, for action. And I think that ceramics is a site in the act of resistance and resilience, of criticism and of commentary. The material that we hold in our hands holds a global history and contemporary presence. And the objects we make with this material address sweeping and specific subjects and themes and really revolutionary endeavors. So as artists and consumers, we utilize this material and the labor and the lives. So I continuously ask myself, well, where does our clay come from? And who's in our clay? So clay, is this material that really permeates our lives, and it tells stories. It moves through histories and geographies. So clay, from cuneiform tablets to biomedical implants that we have there on the left, from the tiles on the space shuttle to the bricks that African American slaves used to build the White House, from the earth from which we harvest our food to the cup that's on our kitchen table, clay as a cultural material envelops our lives. And I think that its ubiquity evokes both social and political, domestic space and public place, private and shared, different aesthetics and functions. And I think the breadth and depth of this material is most apparent when we see all the hands that have worked it, we hear the voices, and we understand the abundance of narratives. So as myths blanket and indoctrinate, action and resistance occurs in society, in education, in art, and culture, concurrently and cooperatively. So I think national mythologies really depend on hiding truths of history and the present, and blaming and stigmatizing and often criminalizing those who are most vulnerable by those in power. And so by exposing the falsehoods of myths through multiple systems of knowledge, I think that we can interdependently share the depth and beauty of transformative change. Thank you very much.
much. There's so much in that time. So next, I'd like to introduce Sana. You ready? Okay, so Sana Musasama began traveling as a way to recover identity and cultural place. She studied Mende pottery, is it Mende? In Sierra Leone from 74 to 75, and ventured later to Japan, 1974 to 75. Japan, China, South America, and Cambodia. Wow. Her exhibition, My Journey, was exhibited at the Clay Arts Center in 2012, and she's recently exhibited at the Southeast Queens Biennial. Please join me in welcoming Sana Musasama.
Hello, everyone. I'm very, very happy to be here. Clayworks is one of my favorite places. I've been thinking a great deal about the title of They, used by my students who are correcting me constantly in the classroom. I teach at John Jay, Hunter College, Jamaica Arts Center, and PS 36. I'm an adjunct, so you can tell, multiple jobs. So this word they, and just to say a little bit about myself, I'm a native New Yorker. I grew up in St. Albans, Queens. I have 4 sisters. I live in the house that I grew up in currently. My parents come from the segregated South. My mother were alive, she'd be 103, and I buried her sister 1 month ago at the age of 95, Aunt Ruth. My Aunt Ruth, when Obama was coming into office, could not be happy. She said always, "It's too late for me. It came too late in my history. I've seen too much. I've witnessed too much. I've heard too much. It's too late for me." And she turned her back on that election. We tried to persuade her to vote. We tried to encourage her. I don't know that she did, but I do remember her saying, "It's too late." My mother and father, my mother was a domestic, and I'm a family wife. My father made a career out of the military. Those were deferred dreams. My father wanted to be a lawyer, but coming from the segregated South, being born in 1970, there weren't those options. And my mom wanted to be out of the South and fight Jim Crow and the Klan. Just a teeny little story, visiting my aunt over the last year, I would have to go for long walks because watching her suffering was extremely difficult for me. And so I went to a cafe, which was now run by a New Yorker in Florence, South Carolina. I just went in to get coffee and was reading the billboard. And a woman came up to me and said, "Are you a Durante?" And I thought for a minute and said, "No, but that was my mother's birth name." I said, "No, I'm not." And she said, "What about Dorothy Durante?" I said, "That's my mom's sister. She died 8 years ago." She said, "What about Sadie Durante?" I said, "That's my mom. She died 40 years ago." And she said, "And what about Ruth?" And I said, "Ruth is in transition. She's ill." She said, "She was my school teacher. She taught me economics." And then she went on to tell me this story, and I began to tremble and self-destruct. She said she wore high-heeled school shoes and red lipstick into the classroom. And that she empowered, the classrooms were segregated, that she empowered the black girls that were there, that they could be anything they wanted to be. She had high-heeled heels and red lipstick, and she said at the end of the day, she'd go to the closet and kick off her high-heeled shoes and put on her bobby socks and her loafers and pull out a 2x4. And she'd gather the 8 girls that were in the classroom, and she'd walk them down dense country roads, tree-lined, and their parents would come out from their farms. And as each parent would come out, she'd push a kid and go in, and the parent would hush the kid in. When she'd get the 6th or 7th kid in, these parents would then come out in the middle of the road and hold hands as they watched my aunt walk to safety and flag, "I'm okay." I was trembling as she told me this story, and I said, "What was the 2x4? She said, "To fight off the Klan teenagers that were hiding in the bushes that were waiting to violate a little girl, murder her, and violate her." She said, "Your aunt pushed roadblocks out of the way so that we could be who we are." And I said, "Would you come and see her tonight?" And she said, "I will." And hours went by, and I told my sisters, and I thought she wasn't going to come. And then at 8 o'clock, the bell rang, And when I opened the door, there was Renetta with a 2x4 walking in. And I said, she says, where is she? She was so beautiful. I said, well, she's beautiful in a different way now. She says, move out of the way. She came and she held that 2x4, and I don't think my aunt could see at this point. And she said, this is a symbol that you use to tell all 4 of us, 8 of us, that we could be whatever we wanted to be. Vicariously, my aunt taught me and my 4 sisters that we could be whatever we could be. My mother and father ran away to New York. They did not want us to see colored-only toilets and restaurants. They didn't want us to go into the back door. We always heard this word of they all the time, and it was always the avenue 4 blocks away where the wealthy kids lived that went to private schools that my mother cleaned their houses. Always around the dinner table, examples of they were the other, what we weren't. My parents valued education and instilled in us that this was the only way to go beyond otherness, because that's what she considered us to be. And me being a creative kid, she wanted me to have that experience, but it didn't exist in my community that was economically challenged, but not spiritually challenged, and not love challenged. All those wonderful things were there, but the flow of money was not necessarily there. So open enrollment existed in the 60s, and so my parents got me into a school that a bus had to pick me up and take me. And I integrated PS90 in the 5th grade. I was the only black kid out of 2,000. The first day of school, the teacher told me what they meant in another kind of way, because the shift in our life is always happening different ways, and the they becomes different. I work in Cambodia with sex slaves. They were they. I worked with 16 years in the incarceration center with inmates. They were they. I'm now working with students that constantly tell me, Sam, do not use her or she with me once again or I'll punch you. I said, okay. So they shifts and changes. So when I went to school the first day, my mother sacrificed to get me this beautiful dress. I sat down in the classroom, and I'll never forget the teacher's name was Mrs. Bander. And she said, to everyone, I want you to draw your families. And she gave everybody paper. And she walked around the room with a box of crayons. And I was really eager to show off my skills if I could draw and paint, because I was creative. My mother, father encouraged that in me. And when she got to me, I waited right there, sitting there like the perfect 9-year-old. And I looked up, and she handed me a black crayon and said, this is all you need. And I just didn't understand, so I put my hand and reached into the box, and she slapped me. And I jumped so high in the seat that everybody in the classroom laughed. And I drew my family with a black crayon that day. And I've never, ever forgotten that experience, that day I became another kind of they. Open enrollment, which was supposed to do something good, didn't do so good for me. I never had a friend, was never invited to a birthday party. No one ever came to my house. The collars of my dresses were examined every day as I marched into the classroom. When I spoke back, which I didn't do often because I came from a family that you don't talk back, whenever I did, I was a disgrace to my race. This thing about they is something that is a question I'm here to hold hands with, to get feedback, to understand, to be better about it. I'd like to open this discussion to all of us. Thank you.
I am so happy to be here today with obviously these incredible people that just describe some of their experiences to you. And you know, what's interesting for me is, you know, often I get asked to come to places and be a speaker, and today I'm helping to, you know, moderate this panel. And what's really wonderful about that is, you know, I think a lot of times when we're speaking, we're not in a place where we're able to learn. We're just sort of like sharing our experience, right? And maybe you learn a little bit at the end, but I'm really here to learn today, because there's so much that I don't know. And I think what's really hard being on my side of things is, you know, when I go places, people will ask me questions as if I have the answers, And you know, most of the time the people that are asking me the questions know way more about that topic than I do. You know, so it's just like somebody who's a potter, and maybe I do a little bit of hip hop, and I grew up doing graffiti, and someone will ask me a question about politics, and I go, I don't know, what do you think? You know? So it's a really incredible opportunity to be here. And so one point that I think is really important to discuss is why I began to work with clay. And so my first day of high school in Philadelphia, I learned a recent statistic that only 52% of children that graduate from middle school go on to high school. So I was part of that 52%, so I made it. So I get to high school the first day of school, and all of the Black and Latino schools in Philadelphia, we were really trained in order to go out and get jobs afterwards. So these were vocational, technical institutions. So I was told you're going to be in culinary arts, and I was so happy because I love to cook, right? So I go into the first day of school, and the teacher hands me a textbook, and she says, just write down word for word what's in here, so if people look inside, it looks like you're doing something. So that was my high school experience. And so what's interesting about that is when I went to go in community college, it was sort of at a situation where I didn't really see my life going anywhere. I had 57 first cousins, and all the men were incarcerated, and I saw myself going in the same direction. And so I wind up hanging out with some of my family in Florida, and they're like, yo, community college classes are only like $300. It's Florida, it's really cheap. So I take this class, but I didn't want to sign up for anything where my education would be exposed, where people would be able to see how far behind I was in my comprehension. And so when I started working on the Potter's Wheel, it sort of came out of this like, I don't want anybody to know where I came from. It's just interesting that in many ways, all my artwork is about where I come from. And so years later, just recently, I found myself being part of this clay studio project, and I'm so happy to be a part of what we're doing here at Clay Arts Center. And I think there's so many important things that are happening across the country. Just like, for example, we might not think about all the like little small things, interactions that happen, but I had my students, I was in a classroom that I actually wanted to be my own elementary school. And I was teaching third graders, and my project was for them to make self-portrait, sculpting 3 things that were distinctive that they liked about themselves. So they had to like make something, and I showed them a model that I made, and it wasn't like this really articulated model. It was sort of like what you would imagine, you know, a kid would sculpt, and that's kind of like where I am right now, my sculpting. And so the kids are looking at this, and then they start making it, and I see one kid in the corner, his name is Nasim, and it reminds me very much of myself. He's sort of like a chubby kid, a little awkward, kind of sitting all by himself, because, you know, he didn't want to get picked on. So I go up to him, and he's sculpting a chef, and I go, a chef, right? So I go, Nasim, I was like, you're sculpting a chef? I was like, you like to cook? And he's like, yeah, I like to cook. I was like, well, what do you like to cook? He's like, I don't have a signature dish yet. Just thinking to myself about like his sense of humor, right? And the way that he sees the world. And maybe he's faced a few things in his short life, but at the same time, like this interaction, it's not what's implied is that he can somehow become a really famous sculptor and make $1 million out of it. What's implied is somebody that looks like him is successful at doing this thing. And what that means isn't that you have to be a sculptor or potter. What it means is you can choose whatever the hell it is you want to do and be successful at it. As long as you're passionate about it, as long as you pursue it, right? And so that's what I found really so incredible about that experience. And so as an artist, I've really only been working in the visual arts for about 10 years. And so I went straight from community college classes to my undergraduate, to my graduate degree, to being a professor. And so I have undergraduate students who have more experience than I do. And so I'm often in this position where I'm thinking to myself, what do I have to offer? Like what is it about, you know, me and my experience? And so one of the things that I feel like is really important in education is often, especially in the crafts, we're sort of like always working towards this like higher goal of somehow being the very best at something. You know, it's like you're gonna make pottery, you're gonna be the very best potter. You're gonna sculpt, you gotta make hyper-realistic sculptures, right? And in that way we have tangible metrics in order to judge you and say, you are really good at this one thing, okay? So for me, what I've realized in this inner sort of working and thinking about myself about what it is that I have to offer, I realize that for me, it's not this sort of idea of having to be the very best at something. Sometimes it's the uniqueness of all the things that you're mediocre at, you know? So like maybe I'm a mediocre potter, maybe I'm a mediocre rapper, maybe I'm like, you know, this, maybe I'm that. But at the same time, it's like, whoa, you're also somebody who's a rapper, social activist, and so I don't have to be good at any of those things, because it's a matter of like, really all I want to do is participate in them, right? And maybe the overlap and the fact that I can sort of reach to these maybe communities that normally wouldn't interact together, it's a compelling sort of way to engage people. And so that's one of the things I encourage my students to, and I think it's really important in the community, is to sort of relieve yourself of this responsibility to be the very best at something. And sometimes you need to just participate. And so I feel really honored to participate with this group of artists who, and community activists who clearly, you know, have a lot more knowledge in things than I do. And so I just want to listen, right? And I want to ask questions. And I hope that you guys will be able to have 2 ears and 1 mouth, right? So is it time for us to just join together here and start this panel? Does that sound good? All right, let's get a round of applause, everybody. We're going to have all the players come up. Maybe move it close enough so you can talk and then pass around that. So I think what we want to do is we want to get to a few prompts that I have here, some ideas that I thought were really important to discuss, some life questions that I had before, and I think you folks may have gotten these questions beforehand, and then I think from there, depending on where we're in the conversation, it'd be really great to reach out to the community here and see what responses people have, either in terms of questions or just thoughts that you want to share. So, this is a really good question, and I'm curious to see how everybody responds to this, which is, where do you feel there is a great need for change in the crafts? So I would imagine the crafts being the type of craft that we're involved in, which is sort of like the handmade art crafts, right? So maybe if you can share a little bit of your thoughts on where you feel like there's a space for some real change here. So we can slide over this microphone if anybody wants to start first. Or... Okay.
Changing crafts. I think a lot about crafts within institutional spaces. Is that okay? Enough that you can hear me? And so I think that when crafts are institutionalized in spaces of universities or museums or galleries, I think often those spaces ignore or overlook the historic foundation and the many ways in which it continues to be practiced today. I think those are often spaces of women and spaces of people of color. And I think that when this sort of narrative of craft, I think that is told within those institutional spaces, is really a story of erasure. And I think when those spaces, we hear a lot about diversity and inclusivity, you know, within these institutional spaces. But I think when those attempts are made, it's done in a way that, for me, feels very tokenized and often through, or really maintains a canon of constructed whiteness within those spaces. And so I think about some terms that are perhaps we've heard in the areas of craft, like craftivism or DIY or makers. I think that these are all terms that refer to practices that have existed for a very long time and that continue to be practiced, often amongst communities that are often marginalized. And so I feel like we see is this often this appropriating and a rebranding of things that have existed. You know, I think of, you know, sewing circles or quilting and the long history of that, often of women of color. And that is about community and organizing and storytelling and resistance to oppression. And so I think these historic foundations in this rebranding is forgotten, you know, is sort of left out of this narrow frame that has been constructed around craft within these institutional settings. And so I think I'm more compelled when, you know, I think these spaces, I think this happens within universities and like within spaces like makers labs that we're seeing a lot more of. I think those spaces become really exclusionary and kind of hermetic. And so I'm interested more in how can we utilize the resources of those institutions, but also the abundance of resources and knowledge and experience from different communities that I think are often left out of those spaces because the frame doesn't fit them. And how can we bring this together to create much more dynamic spaces that really express the multiplicity of experiences and knowledge and different ways of working and practice and tools and technologies together. I think that to me is much more expansive and meaningful, and where really change can come from that.
Can I just ask you a quick question? What does the word hermetic mean?
Something that is insular.
Okay.
Sealed, yeah.
It's always important to ask that question, guys, because I learned so much. When you have that vocabulary, you can get really distinctive about how you engage folks, and I just find that language is so important to ask if you don't know.
Everyone can hear me? How about now? Okay. So piggybacking on Lauren, because I agree so much with what you're saying, it's just when you began to talk about institutions, I immediately began to think about higher institutions, and I think that exposure to the crafts of creativity is primary. I think neighborhoods, community centers, churches, PTAs, labs, early, so that I don't get a student at Hunter College or John Day College who's a student of economically challenged background, maybe a brown person, who lacks the confidence to even trust that they have a favorite color, because the foundation.
Talk into the microphone.
Because as a child, the foundation wasn't encouraged. The foundation wasn't available for the exposure. So much happens watching a child learn how to take yellow, mix it with brown, come up with green. So much curiosity, a seed is planted there. It's like fertile ground that travels through them, that they've done something that's unique to them. And when it starts at 3, 4, 5, 7, 8, the foundation of those little pyramids of their bodies that my mother always told us that our bodies were pyramids, and when we were acting up, we were missing bricks. Get in your room and build yourself up. So I look at little children all over the world in my neighborhood who are kicking a rock instead of a paintbrush, that portable schools. All of that should start at such an early level that confidence is there by the time they get to institutions, so they're empowered to break through those boundaries and those roadblocks and speak up and talk back in a professional way to someone who's indirectly participating in injustice in the way that they talk to them. Art is so transformative. It's so empowering. I've been working with one little girl from the age of 3, and she's now 9.5 years old. And when it was time to put up my show at the Southeast Queens Biennial, I took my students over with me after class and said, "You guys are going to help me." And Sashi, who's now almost 11, was the guy. She took me aside and said, "Could you explain to me the concept behind these pieces?" And I just looked at her. I didn't know what the word concept meant. But because her parents believe in the creative transformation of the soul of their children, she's been there since she's 3. So I made her the leader of the group and said, "It's about the maple tree movement. We're three groups of people spoke out against sugarcane plantation exploitation for human. She was able to tell, like, you're doing this, you're doing this, you're doing that. I can't get a college student to have who comes from an economically challenged or comes from a war-torn country to even have the confidence. In Cambodia, with the girls that I've worked with for 12 years, when I ask them what their favorite color is, their response is, my favorite color be what you want it to be. What do you want to be when you grow up, Ren? I be what you want me to be. Genocides have stripped this idea of dreaming out of us, stripped it out of us as well. And as we work back, I remember that. So we need to graduate level, like just throw the ball out the park, you know.
Just to sort of mirror what Lauren and Sana have already said, coming from a community point of view, I think at the point of education, early education is so very important because there's been a sort of a separation of identity from the origin of the thing, and so much of what we know and what we're involved in now had its origins, and we're not learning about what those origins are. We're not understanding, the Gullah language. We're not understanding the importance and the history of quilting as it was for the enslaved people and how that kept them going. And so when we sort of separate the origin of the thing from what we're teaching kids, they cannot develop their own identity. They cannot develop a richness of understanding around that and the language that goes along with that. And so I'm not an artist myself in terms of, the construct of art, in terms of creating something out of clay or what have you. But for children to have that connection, to understand the origin of the thing, to understand the history of the thing, is so very important. And that has been separated, whether it is scientific experiments and the understanding of the importance of George Washington Carver and what he did and what he brought, understanding, traffic lights and who created traffic lights and who invented that, not understanding that you have a direct connection to that history, I think is something that needs to be righted, and it should start at the elementary and the kindergarten level. For parents, seeing their kids in the classroom when they're very young, and they do arts and crafts, it's such a wonderful thing. Yet they don't have that connection to the origins of where many of these ideas come from, and I think that's a problem.
So, a few things I'd like to just share. A couple of recent experiences. One of them being that I was part of a panel, and they have two separate sort of brackets for some things that we were deciding. One of them was this notion of traditional arts, and then another was this notion of crafts. And so, and they also have qualifications like painting, drawing, photography, okay? So with our nominees, our applicants for the idea of traditional arts, we had many indigenous potters, people working with fiber work, and Mexican-American people sort of working in that tradition. And then on the side of the crafts, we had one black man for 200 applicants. And so we're sort of going through this and we're thinking a little bit about what that means, because on the traditional arts end, it was almost the polar opposite. We had, some people who would identify as white, working sort of in these other traditions. And one of the things that I'd like for you to think a little bit about is that often historically when we have artists of color working in something like the crafts, like we identify, we see it as more of a connection to their heritage and culture. And so in many ways they become invisible. They're just sort of part of this grander narrative, right? Like you're not so-and-so who makes Mexican pottery, you're a Mexican potter, right? And so I think that value system is really different, really interesting, because one of the things that I think I've argued for in terms of the crafts is being specific in using or thinking about what makes this person distinctive and giving that currency to whatever it is that you're making a decision on. So if you have 1 out of 200 people that are black and they're applying for something, that person's experience And you see how complicated it is, right? Just with the people that we have here sharing just a few of their experiences, you can assume that if they have one person out of those 200, that person has something completely different to bring than most of the. So you have to give that currency. You can't just say that that's valueless and that person is in an even place with everyone else. And so I'll explain to you a little bit about what that looks like. So how many of you guys have ever gotten a fruit salad and you just get way too much cantaloupe? Raise your hands. Right? There's a lot of cantaloupe-ass fruit salads in this world, okay? So a few summers ago, I was working in the studio, and my assistant, she really liked fruit salad. And so we get this fruit salad, there was just one kiwi on top. So no matter what, her and I would fight over whoever got to the kiwi. And then the second thing was whatever fruit that kiwi touched next had the acidity from it, right? That flavor from it. And so the truth is that cantaloupe is a really great fruit, right? It can be diverse in itself, depending on how close it is to the rind or how close it is to the center. But because we had that one kiwi, it became a spectacle. And all of a sudden, we're all focused on that kiwi because we have sort of this like desire to get to it first. And so if we have this salad that was evenly distributed with strawberries, kiwis, and cantaloupe, then all of those things become distinctive within that, and we grow to appreciate them all for their differences and experiences. And so what winds up happening a lot of times is that folks think about the idea of diversity as somehow being a charitable exercise. As if like by promoting diversity, you're doing something good for black people, you're doing something good for people of color. Well, in reality, diversity is really good for everyone, especially white people, because it makes you more distinctive within the context of your own culture and the people that are around you. And so I think for the crafts, one of the things that I feel like it's really difficult is someone like me who maybe my best skill sets happen to be working in clay. And I didn't find that until the age of 26. And the reason why is because someone like me is never going to come and interact with clay unless they somehow happen upon it in college and then they fall in love with the material. And so a lot of the work that folks like us do is figuring out how to just somehow get that clay into their hands. As Sana was mentioning, that exposure, because of the idea that like we're probably not going to make a bunch of craft artists within the next 10 years. But the more people that we expose to it, we're really looking at a change within the next 25 years, right? So if you can stop giving yourself this idea that somehow the things you do right now, you're going to see change next year, and you start thinking to yourself, like, the things I'm doing right now I may never see, but they're really worthy of doing right now, I think that's the sort of mentality that's really going to help us move forward, rather than constantly looking for the system of checks and balances where, like, immediately we do something, we get something back. So I think that the work that you folks are doing, and that I'd like to think I'm doing, is going to make a huge difference. And what's really great is that we don't necessarily get to see the results of that, but we know that that is going to mean something one day. So in order to get to our next sort of question here, I'd like to just introduce this idea to sort of share a little bit of my experience and why I decided to pose this question. Who I am as a maker is not who I am as a consumer. And so I'm a person of color. I come from one of the most poor neighborhoods in the country. I come from a really violent place. And so I make pottery. I can't really make anything else. Like the things I make, like I tried painting birds for a long time on pottery, and I get a lot of like support. People would buy my stuff, and I think pots with birds on them are great. But the point is like after a while, it became this thing where like I was lying to myself, and I was lying to everyone around me because I was trying to adapt to the cultures I found myself in. And so, but that doesn't mean when I go out and make pottery, I want political pottery, or that I want even stuff that's illustrated on it. When I go to buy pottery, I'm looking for really functional things. Like I collect batter bowls. I love wood-fired pottery, right? And so there's this assumption that what I'm making is who I am, even as a consumer. And so that brings us to the question is, what is the biggest misconception about struggles of people of color in marginalized community or marginalized communities faced within the visual arts? So what are some of the biggest misconceptions and struggles that you can see that we have within these communities in the visual arts?
For myself, being the first Black American in a lot of residencies that I participated in around the world and even in the United States, I became an ambassador for the entire race. So I think one of the biggest misconceptions is that my story is everybody's story. I think individually we have, collectively, we share common denominators, and then we do not. As a Black student at Alfred, I was told to make work about my hair. Why? Because they found it funny. Well, I didn't want to make art about my hair. Then the next thing was, why don't you make art about being Black? Nobody else was told to make art about their race, or even about their gender. So this misconception is that because somebody is unaware or inexperienced in multiple groups, they make a decision for all groups. And it's very, very hurtful, it's very, very painful, and it's a burden that you must carry. So it's almost to a point where you just start building up all these scabs that you have to constantly get picked off. So now in my development as an artist and an educator, I'm a little impatient with stupid questions. How do you comb your hair? Or how do you wash it? Tell somebody they have to do their own personal research. My shift is now, do it yourself. You find out. I know your story. But 20 years ago was another kind of story. Well, I go and buy shampoo, and I do it this way, and it's kinky, and I use a bigger comb with bigger teeth. I no longer can do it that way, but I think in the classroom situations that I've taught, I put that into my students so that they can continue to tell their stories in a much more empowered way, that when it's said to them, it doesn't hurt like it hurt me, that it rolls off their back and say, you idiot, you don't know that? Do I have to tell you everything? This is what I had a student tell another student the other day in the classroom, and I could not have done that at that age. So being an ambassador has been a way. It also makes me think of wherever I've been in the world. I've been an ambassador, even if I'm traveling on the continent of Africa. So in Mendeland, where I lived the longest 19 months, where I learned about female excision, and my work is about my travels and what I see as a woman. I was called Pomoy, and I didn't know the language at the time, but I could always tell when they said Pomoy, and I looked at them and they dart and run, it wasn't a nice name. So finally I went to the post office and asked the woman there, what does Pomoy mean? And she says, never mind, son. I said, tell me what it means. She said, it means black skin, white land. You're a tree with no roots on it. So it's so interesting. So the shift, constantly the shift.
Can we just, Sana just said she's the first Black woman in a lot of residencies in this country. Can we please give that a round of applause? You have a historic figure in front of you right now. Like, I think what I was saying about the things we do right now, 25 years later, like honestly, this is something I shared at our open, and I don't think I would be where I am right now if you hadn't done what you did. So I think it's really important to acknowledge that at all times, because now when I go somewhere, you know, people aren't like asking me a lot of these questions. They're not, they're just, I mean, there's still a little bit of awkwardness, but I think you've trailblazed the way for a lot of us, so thank you.
I think locally a misperception is that there is not an appreciation for certain arts. And that's not true, because as I said in my opening remarks, our population is majority Hispanic, Latinx people, and they come from a very rich tradition of creating plates and pots and you know, the utensils that they used to cook with. That is their ancestry. And so for people to think that there may not be an appreciation by some folks here locally is a huge misperception. And I would venture to say that many people who live here can teach us a thing or two about how to put together and how to create pots and pottery and things of those ilks. And we also have so many artisans of other type, woodworkers, and a variety of artisans who were very much involved in creating that art in their home country, but you know, once they've come to the United States and once they come here, have had to do other things in order to survive, in order to make ends meet, in order to you know, stitch together a living. And so it's not from lack of appreciation. Again, it comes from where in my life do I have the time and the privilege and the luxury of spending time doing this as opposed to doing what I need to do to make sure that my children are fed and clothed and housed, and that they're going to class and things of that sort. So that would be my thought around any misperceptions.
I think that when some of the things that Sana was bringing up and Roberto, when I think about when residencies are, when new resident artists are chosen for a program, or when an academic appointment is given, or a show is curated, or content is chosen for a conference, and when we see a lack of representation in those spaces, I think there's this idea, well, there just weren't any. And I think that's completely false and inaccurate. And I think when places or people respond in that way, I think to me that just shows a very limited and constrained knowledge and idea of what art and craft and art who is making. I think that shows often very narrow framework that a lot of these spaces are functioning from and working from. And it makes me think of this idea of frames. Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the term intersectionality, speaks about this quite a bit. And this idea of intersectionality is when how certain social justice problems like racism and sexism overlap. And when they overlap, there are layers of social injustices that come from that. And she tells how she came to this, using this word to describe that experience, from a woman, Emma de Graffenried, I believe is her name. And she was an African-American woman who brought a suit against a car manufacturing plant, I believe. And said, she was discriminated against because she was a black woman. And the court said, well, we have laws that protect African Americans in the workplace, and we have laws that protect women in the workplace. So what, there should be a law special for being a black woman, and that would give you advantage. But the reality was in this organization that all of the jobs that went to African Americans were industrial jobs, and they only went to men. And all the jobs that were given to women were the secretarial jobs, and they only hired white women for that. So as a black woman, there was no place for her there. And so rather than the judge expanding the frame from which they were functioning, he dismissed her. And she was pushed away and pushed out. And I think that's what happens often in our arts organizations and institutions. The frame is a narrow frame. If you think about galleries, they're supposed to be these white cubes that are supposed to be spaces that are objective and void of context, for the artist to bring in the work. Well, that's not true either. There's context there. There's history there. It is a narrow history. It's often perhaps based on this a Eurocentric history. So many people fall out of that. And I think that if you're not seeing your own cultural perspective, well, that means that I think you are privileged, so you don't have to. That you're not being questioned. You're not being asked to make work about whatever that person, their perception of you is. But all art has cultural context. And so I think it's, to me, more how do we expand those frames, push those frames out, so that it is not this select few, and that is presented as this sort of dominant or the default narrative, and everything else falls to the margins of that.
So those are really great answers, and I think one of the, in terms of what Sana's discussing, this notion of ambassador, I think there's also a few misconceptions to what we think that means. I think sometimes we think of, when we're engaged in this conversation about race, as though somehow people of color are sort of like policing. Like, let's say we come to the Clay Arts Center, all of a sudden it's like, you gotta be on your toes because I'm gonna be next to you and I'm gonna say things to, like, keep you in check with your whiteness. And it's not like that. It's sort of like, this idea of intersectionality I find really compelling, because you have two choices to participate in that. You can participate in what I call the Oppression Olympics, which is where, like, I could be here and I can tell you, man, like, making this pottery's like really difficult because of this. You can go, well, it's hard for me too, and this is why. Or you can say, yeah, I know what you mean, because, you know, I've kind of gone through something as well. Like, what do you feel about this? You see, so that second is sort of like thinking a little bit about where we overlap and using that to be able to connect with other human beings, rather than saying, well, I don't really care about what you've been through because I've also been through something else. So that's more divisive. So where this comes into a place like a community arts center or even a classroom is, for example, when someone like me makes artwork, it's seen as political, even if my intention wasn't to be political. So if we can look at this Greek pot that Lauren Sandler showed to begin our thing. So like if somebody were going around today making Greek pottery, having people doing gay sex or referring to it on there, that would be like a really political pot. And people would protest it maybe. People would think it's, you know, have all sorts of comments on it. And so it's almost like depending on your difference, your theyness, all of a sudden the things you're making are political. And so in terms of that idea of ambassador, I want to give you a few examples of exactly what that looks like. So I'm in a classroom and one of my students starts turning wood. And so she's turning wood and she shows us a few of her pieces, and they were beautiful works of art. She'd really learned how to make these beautiful sort of forms. She hangs them up. And this happened to be a week after Mike Brown was killed. And I said, well, you do know that you made police batons, right? You know, like, and she's like, well, yeah, I can see where they kind of look like that, because it was these objects, and then she had like kids breaking piñatas open with these objects. And I said, well, you know, for someone like me, when I see that object, I think a little bit about violence and the fact that we just, you know, had the situation happen with Mike Brown. You know, it's a difficult thing because I'm looking at it from this perspective. So the idea is you don't have to stop making that thing. The thing is you have to be conscious of all the different ways people are going to interpret that thing, and you have to be able to understand, you know, how to talk about it. You have something? Okay. So there's that. So that's the common role that maybe somebody thinks that I participate in this discourse. The other way is I'm in a classroom and someone's making a big wooden sculpture. So he's making a foot tall wooden sculpture. And he's a white kid from Minnesota, white male, identifies as male. So we're sitting there, we're having a discussion. People are asking where he got the wood. So I got the wood from the neighborhood. There's sort of like this pile of wood that they have there, and I'm going to return it afterwards. Well, what do the people in the neighborhood look like? Well, they're this, they're that. And so it started getting to this point where people were accusing him of like being, you know, sort of like not being aware of his surroundings and stealing wood from a poor neighborhood, and it somehow having racial implications. And so, you know, in my particular case, coming from this neighborhood, I'm like, wait, this is not the appropriate place to have this conversation. Because if every time somebody makes a work of art and all of a sudden we say this is about race, then when it actually becomes an issue, like this baton, you know, we water it down to the point where like people become really cynical. And all of a sudden, all the people who would normally want to engage with that conversation are just so exhausted by it. So it's really, I think it's really important to understand this idea of ambassador. It's complicated. It's not just as simple as like policing folks, because it's not, you're just a participant in it. And sometimes it comes from this other end where, you know, because you've had the experience, you can also like give somebody a bit of freedom and say, well, I don't get that. Like I don't feel a burden of race because of this work. That doesn't give you permission to do it across the board. That's just my own opinion. I can only speak for myself. And so, you know, in this what Lauren was referring to in terms of, you know, having exhibitions and, you know, people will say, or hiring someone, and people saying, well, we just didn't have anybody in the applicant pool. Well, so in my old alma mater, is anybody here from Kansas City Art Institute? Okay. Do you do anything there now? Okay. You teach there?
Yeah.
Okay. So good, because I'm going to talk shit. So they have one person that's, you know, doesn't identify as a person of color, but he has like a Spanish name. But the faculty across the board, white, right? And so a few years ago, they have this call for a professor. And so, you know, I don't expect every time I apply for a job to get an interview, but I expect them to interview somebody who's a person of color if there's an applicant available and who's qualified for the job. Like, there's no reason for you to say that I'm not as qualified as the 8 other people you interviewed. So if you didn't choose me to be the 3 people you bring on, that's fine. But if you have an all-white faculty in 2017, you better fucking call me. Because I work hard to get that call, right? And so it's if you don't have any excuses. And so after that whole thing went through, and these are the same, you know, when you go through this, it's so hard to get a job. And you know the other people that are out for a job, you know they're all worth it. And when you get into that 3, that 8, you're just like, man, I really hope I get this job, but I'm not going to be sad if so-and-so gets this job. So it becomes insular in this way. And so going through all this process of applying to almost every school and at least getting a call, right? And going to my alma mater and them not even considering me for a phone call. What that said to me was, this is not important to us, right? Doesn't mean you have to hire me. Doesn't mean that I have to skip and I get extra credit because I'm a person of color and you hire me. What that means is if you're dedicated to the discourse of having diversity in all different ways, you have to at least throw out that interview. But with someone like me, who maybe my skill set is a little bit better with communication than it is with the making, they probably feared that I would do really good in an interview. So the easiest thing to do is to just not interview me, right? And so I made them aware of that. I wrote them a really long letter, and I said, you know what? When I was in art school, people called me a Mexican gangster. A student, a white boy, made an art project that had the N-word in 13-foot tall letters on an outdoor wall. And I was like, I ran through all the different things that my gay friends went through at your school, all the different ways that we were literally called spick, and we were literally called all these names. Somebody drew a sombrero that was an alien ship to describe my participation in the school. So this is your school, and you have a person of color that's applying, and you do not interview them. I was like, that's a problem. And so this is where this idea of ambassador comes in. Sometimes it's in defending, like just a normal kid's ability to just make a wooden sculpture without with just being able to do his research. And sometimes it comes in by holding people accountable, even when it's awkward, right? Because the awkwardness is that I was the person up for the job. And so it makes me sound really fulfilling, saying you should have interviewed me, but being the person on the other side and doing the interview, I knew that I was qualified for that. So how do we, I guess before we get to our next question, I think maybe if some of the folks here can give examples of where we've seen scenarios where maybe somebody makes I'll use the phrase excuse, for there wasn't the applicant pool, and that's why they didn't hire them, and ways that you can see, maybe that we can make efforts towards fixing that. So for example, the idea that there's plenty of qualified people, I think that so many times when we have this list of top 15 potters or something like that, you could completely make that list of women, right? You don't have to go look for men to do that list. I mean, if it's valid, it's valid. But so for me, recently I was working on an exhibition of emerging artists, and I said, I'm going to make a show that's not about these people being women. I'm going to make a show about them being emerging artists. But all the people that are in there happen to be women because they're the best artists that I could think of for this slot. And so it's really interesting that if you frame your mind in the right way and you say that, yes, if I have to think about 5 people that are the best up-and-coming artists, I can easily do that and include women. I don't have to say the show's about women. I can just say the show's about emerging artists and then invite people who I think are qualified. So if maybe you guys can shed some light on maybe some ways that you've seen it done, or maybe some suggestions, because I always think it's important for people that are in these positions to maybe hear about ways that folks have worked towards fixing that.
I taught at the Dalton School in Manhattan for about 7 years, and Dalton School was a very, very wealthy school, wealthy New York City kids, and they were very interested in diversifying, and they kept saying, we never get black applicants. So there are many, many ways to open up, push those boundaries into finding people, but first people have to realize that everybody's voice needs to be at that table. And at that table on every level, not just the bottom level. I had an incident at Hunter College where my sculptures were thrown out. And when I began to fight it, I started at the bottom, of course, with the lowest man on the totem pole, who was an immigrant, who didn't understand that the object that he saw was art and threw it out. So as I was climbing the ladder to fight the school. This should not have happened. There wasn't a work order. It went from the immigrant to the dark-skinned Black American, to the light-skinned Black American, to the passing white American, to the light-skinned light-skinned Asian, all the way up to the top. So an area of Hunter College that didn't even knew exist was nothing but white men in Armani suits and briefcases. I could not believe it. I could not believe it. I was in shell shock. The Dalton School, they wanted to diversify. They said that you cannot just advertise in the New York Times. You have to advertise in a diversity of papers, a diversity of people read. You have to want this bad enough. You have to go beyond what is your reference of what the news is. And so they did. They went to the parents of Black American children in school. And that's how I ended up being the ceramics teacher there for 5.5 years. Within 2 weeks of becoming the ceramics teacher, I also became the head of the Black Studies Department. Not Black Students Union. Did I ask for this position? No. Did I feel qualified to this position? No. It was institutional racism, in my opinion. I needed that job. I did the best I could. The kids that I worked with who were very, very brilliant, very, very angry, who were constantly fighting that they got into Dalton because they were Black, and the white kids got in there because of their histories of wealth. So it was always this conflict. Anyway, the students wanted to have Black studies there, so they searched for a professor, and they hired a person who was qualified for the position, who was not African descent of Black Americans. An assembly, the head of the students' union, who was a brilliant young lady, stood up to Peggy McIntosh. She was giving a lecture, a white woman, middle age. She said, "What does this mean if you hire someone to teach students protest and ask in an honorable way for a teacher in their visual image to teach their history? What does it mean when you hire outside the race?" And she said, "It means that the institution you're going to doesn't trust you. Doesn't trust you." Peggy McIntosh got on the stage and said, "My name is Peggy McIntosh. I'm an upper class white woman, and I am racist."
Again, from my experience here locally in Portchester, many people may not know, we do not have any Black teachers at the high school. Yes, I said that. As part of the NAACP, I worked with several members on the education committee to coax and cajole and to encourage the school district to do what they could to make sure that they were able to find candidates, Black candidates, to teach at the high school. Certainly we do have Black people in the school as administrative staff, as custodial staff, as athletic coaches. But to have that academic teacher standing in front of the classroom, we don't have that happening.
Are there Hispanics on the teacher staff?
There are.
Hispanics.
There are. And, you know, in many conversations with school board and superintendents and such, you know, we were sort of told that, well, we just don't find any qualified candidates. And understanding that the school district was in partnership with Manhattanville College and their Department of Education. And for those of you who are familiar with Manhattanville College, it's not very, very diverse in its school, in its classes. So that was the one school that they would constantly go to find their student teachers from. And I said to them, well, why don't we just cast a wider, more diverse net? There's the College of New Rochelle. There's Lehman College that's nearby. There's a variety of schools that they could have cast that net to. And we actually gave them contact information to reach out to those schools. And yet it's still come back to say that they cannot find any qualified candidates. And so again, from my perspective, this is just, whether it's laziness, whether it's there is no will to do that, how far, how much do you need to do, then we're asking you to do that. That's all we're saying, is to make sure that you reach every possible school within a 30-mile radius to ensure that you're finding these qualified candidates. And for me, that term is just code for a lack of will to want to do something like that. So, yeah.
Also, I want to also say, in addition, is that I'm coming up against a large population of students of African American, and Native descent who don't want to go into these institutions, and they're making the choice. No, I don't want to. I'm tired of explaining. I don't want to. I'm tired of educating. So you do have that reality that many are not applying because they don't want to be in that nest of constantly fighting and defending every single day. It's one of my students from Hunter College, went to the Martin, worked for 2 years, and then got accepted into Bard and into Hunter. She said, I'm not going to Bard. I went up there, I saw the neighborhood, I saw the community. I'm not going up there and being the only one that looks like me. I'm going to Hunter, where everybody knows my face. I said, I understand that you don't want to go and fight. I said, you've got a full scholarship into Bard. It opens doors bigger than Hunter will for you. It'll be I heard about your ambassador story, son. I said, yeah, but you're half my age. You're half my age. You've got far more energy and you're much more smarter than I was. So you can fight it in a different way than I couldn't. I saw myself pretty much as a silent witness. Go to Barton, don't blow out the park. Don't go to Hunter where it's safe. Right. And get the same opinion for the next 2.5 years. Unfortunately, she's going to Hunter. She just does it in a full scholarship to Barton. We also are making choices to be entrepreneurs, opening up our own organizations, just like women opened up our own galleries. Right. Here's men's galleries.
Talking to the microphone.
Right.
Yeah. Just like women opened women galleries in the 70s when we couldn't get into main core galleries, just like craft artists opened up craft galleries. People are doing more, opening up own businesses, not going into academia, not wanting to play the game. I remember Chris Staley, who I love from graduate school, called me years ago to come to Penn State and apply for a job. And I looked at all the faculty and looked at the population, and I said, you know something, I love you, Chris, but I don't want to play ball with you guys. I don't want to play ball.
And if I may just say that, yes, so if you're not seeing what you want to do, then create that opportunity for yourself. And I understand that because it's exhausting if you are this, the one person on site who they will, they will have all their students go to you to talk to you because then you'll understand them. And it's just exhausting being that one person that everyone has to turn to because you are the token, because you are the sole representative on campus.
Yeah, I think, Sana, to your point, I think I have these conversations, I think, every year at NCECA. This has been like an ongoing conversation. And I think, NCECA is the annual ceramic conference, the National Council of Education on the Ceramic Arts. It's an annual meeting of ceramic artists, makers, students, educators. It happens in a different city every year. And, I think I've taken, I think it's one of my jobs as one of many white people in the room at NCECA to speak to these issues. And I remember a couple of years ago being in a meeting there, and that language, there's the language of us and them, I'm listening to this and it's like, well, there's a problem right there with the way that we're framing this conversation, but also what you were just saying, Sana, this made me think of this, like, why would a young person of color want to come here? Why would they want to put themselves in this space that does not see them, does not talk to them, does not recognize them? I think that all of this talk of diversity, and then you look at the board of the organization, well,
look at the board. Maybe that, you got to start there. Well, you got to start many places, but change the board. That's I mean, I've had that conversation with a number of people who are on boards and working on diversity, and then I go and I look at the board. I was like, well, change your board. That's like step one. Like, just start there. Like, you have one voice represented on that board. If you have 5 different voices there, well then there, you've just changed everything. Well, that's the beginning of changing. It's the beginning, it's just this one step. So, I mean, I feel, you know, depending on the day you talk to me about this, I'm mostly just really frustrated by it, and I feel, you know, I want to say I don't feel optimistic. I do, and I think, Roberto, I feel like I'm thinking long. I'm thinking like 20 years ahead in the things I'm doing and working on now. You know, I think about recruitment in education and the ways that needs to change. If you think about, you know, there's a lot of talk now about how enrollment is low, especially in our programs, enrollment's low. I'm talking like higher education and the spaces that I more often am functioning in. And part of that is just larger changes in the society. We're post-baby boom, there's less people in college. But then also, if you look at the populations in which there is an increase in going to college, well, that's people of color. So where is the recruitment to going to high schools and primary schools where you have large communities of color and establishing relationships with them and talking to them about, well, there's a path for you here. You know, we have resources. We want to, we have, you know, and have that expressed from top to bottom in the content of that institution and the opportunities and presenting opportunities and community and support. But, you know, I don't see that actually happening. I hear these discussions, but I don't really see that happening in action. So I feel like every time I see a position filled at whatever level, you know, I think there's a problem. That's a problem. Who you just hired there, you know? There's no reason or excuse for that. And I think it's when people do not look beyond their, you know, their Facebook feed. There's a problem. You have to, as you were saying, you have to step outside of perhaps, you know, the spaces you might be moving through. And that means you have to ask other people, and that's why you need that board to be a multiplicity of voices, because then those branches go much further. But I honestly feel quite frustrated by it all, and I don't see it happening. Not the levels and to the degree that I believe that it could be. I think there's a lot of talk, but I feel like it's kind of, it stops fast. You know, maybe that's a bit cynical of me.
No, I think that's what you feel is what you feel, you know, and I think it's right. So we got some feedback here from the audience. So I want to open it up in just one moment. I just want to share a few thoughts before we get to that. First thing is, when we're discussing this idea of change and how we sort of move things forward, I'd like to acknowledge that Play Art Center put this all together and the hard work of Lee and Adam, and I'm sure many other people, but especially these two that I've been working with. So we can please acknowledge this effort to make a great change here. I think that's really incredibly important, because we can always say that we want these things, but to like physically figure out how to put that all in action, it takes a lot of work. So you guys have been working on this for more than a year now, I imagine. So I think that's really important to acknowledge. And then the other thing is, I think one of the hardest things for everyone, including me as a person of color and people that are not, is this idea of like, I think a lot of times we'll be up here talking and everyone is like, yeah, that's right, yeah, that's true, yeah, you know? And then what happens is we're given all these opportunities in life where people will tell us maybe where we're kind of implicated in the problem, and the moment that happens, the moment that you realize that maybe there's a part of something that you're doing or something you're participating in that's hindering moving forward, all of a sudden people get really defensive. And so I've always found, whenever I'm talking about these sort of subjects in the abstract, and I'm saying, this is one of the problems, this is one of the problems, and then the moment that I say, hey, that one thing you did is kind of a problem, all of a sudden that person who's been my biggest advocate is now my biggest nemesis, because I've included them in this sort of system. And so it's also true for me. I'm a person of privilege, right? I'm a man. So there's many things that I've gotten in my life. So there's a situation where I just got this job. And this is like, I wrote down 5 years ago that all the places that I really wanted to teach at. And the very top college was Tyler School of Art. And that's where I got a job at. That never happens. That never happens. But here's the thing. I genuinely thought about not taking this job because of the fact that there's 2 people that work there, and the other person happens to be a man. And I said, in 2017, do I want a 2-man department, right? You have to think about that, right? And so for me, I have to think about my son who can go to school for free. I have to think about my wife. I have to think about all the stuff I can do in the community there. And so yes, I took the job, but the point is that I really deeply thought about it, and I was conflicted about it. And I realized that I'm part of the problem, right? And it's a hard thing to swallow. But the truth is that the only way that anything will ever change is the moments where people engage you in a tough conversation, where it's like, hey, you know, kind of what you did is offensive, and maybe you don't realize it, you know. And then the moment you did it, you're like, oh no, I didn't. You know, we have a lot of goodwill. I'm assuming goodwill from everyone, because I don't think people in this room are like, you know, part of the KKK. I could be wrong. But at the same time, I think that maybe there are some things that we all do that we're unaware of. And the only real way to actually really make change is to have a bunch of awkward conversations with each other. And not that we're policed, but just so that we become more empathetic towards one another. And we're at least aware, right? Awareness is, I think, important. It doesn't mean that we have to completely change. It just means we have to be aware of like that our actions have some sort of impact on others. So we're gonna, I think, take a question or something over here. Yes, yeah, please.
Just a comment. I think it takes work. I teach in a private school. Diversity takes a lot of work, constant work. Our culture is very tribal.
Could you stand up so we could all hear you?
Our culture is very tribal right now. We know it takes work to change the politics. It's just what we need to do. It makes us better people. Clay Art Center is a fabulous place with this wonderful show. And the kids that we teach and the outreach that we do. So we just have to keep getting energized. Thank you for being here. We also know, I love that the show "they" does not just mean people of color, but it means ageism. We know that women, all kinds of backgrounds, learning abilities and challenges, physical abilities and challenges. It's been a very inclusive show, so I think we also need to kind of remember that too. So thank you for being here and for.
I just would just like to say one thing. Lauren said, I am a little optimistic, and I'm optimistic because I'm looking at my sister's children, my grandnieces and nephews, who are unstoppable, and who are going out into the world, who will change it, and who will hold hands with their communities of friends. They're growing up with friends of every race, every class. I wasn't allowed to. I could only be around 4 black kids on my block, and that's all I was invited to. But my nieces and my grandnieces have grown up with a wider net, a bigger world, so I am hopeful. My classroom at Hunter College in my 23 years has become a diverse meeting ground where I'm not no longer the teacher, I'm the listener, and they're guiding me through all their different stories and their different struggles. Also, my residency here at Clayworth, Leah made it incredibly wonderful by bringing in young girls that were living in shelters, White Plains, to be a part of my installation and de-installation. Maybe 14 little black girls who thought they didn't belong in a gallery, and this they did. But what they need to see because of their economically challenged, their background, was another face that looked like their face. And then it made it all easier. So they came in, they sat on the floor, they helped me de-install. I still hear from these girls, do you have a job for me? Can I help you de-install? So we all can play a part, and if we can't play a part, support support the person who wants to play the part. Because not all of us are here to do this kind of work, but help somebody who is.
If I can just, I just want to make a comment. I see lots of hands going up, but just in terms of the young woman who you spoke with, who had the decision, who made the decision between Bard and Hunter, and to just understand all that probably had to go into that decision, including the idea of the wealth gap that we're already living with, and understanding how she chose not to go to Bard, clearly recognizing that that was a full ride, and what that would mean to her after she left school, to not have to carry the weight of debt. Yet she still decided to go to Hunter. So that was a very deep decision for her to make. So I just wanted to point that out.
So I know we have a few. I've seen the hands. You over there, you over here, and over here. So I have a hand. So just one thing to respond, because I think this is a really important thing. What was your name, ma'am, with the magenta? Sarah. So one important thing Sarah was talking a little bit about was the diversity of the show. And one of the things that I think is really important is to know that if let's say we're talking about mostly about one aspect of diversity in race, it's important for a diverse group of people to discuss that topic, because what winds up happening is not just like a us issue, it's not just a person, it's a human issue, right? And so if we have white people that are advocates, right? If we have people with different backgrounds, maybe different countries who don't have the same problems as America, they're talking about this, and it's almost like when you think of Selma, right? You think of people crossing that bridge. If Martin Luther King crossed that bridge with just black people, they would have been assaulted. But because he was there with Jewish people, because he was there with white people, and they were holding hands, that meant that issue was a human issue and not just a race issue. So I think that's really important. And honestly, just through our social media experiences, I've learned so much about how to articulate what it is that I'm trying to do by how Lauren responds to some of my posts. And so I just feel like you're such an amazing advocate for people of color in our field. And also, you sort of have this scholarly approach that is really helpful for me to be able to engage with a broader audience rather than just the people that come from where I come from. And so it's just, you've been such an inspiration that I thought we couldn't have this show without you. So we have, okay, so you're fourth on my list, okay, but I'm going to get to you. Okay, so one over here.
I think there is opportunity for optimism, and I know some of you fought the long, hard battle, and I applaud you for that and paving the way both as women and people of color. But I think art has the potential to unify and cross many different boundaries, be they socioeconomic, race, gender, what have you. And I think it really does have to start with our young kids. And I applaud the work that the Clay Arts Center has done in the community. And I was just up at Musasama this weekend where my daughter is doing an internship in the education department. And I think what we need to do is make art accessible for young kids. And that is going to be the vision now 25 years, but it's so critical in this day and age. It has to be accessible and it has to be free. So those of us who are privileged need to find a way, I believe, to promote the arts in young kids and young families. Musasama has what they call their kids space, and if you have the opportunity to go to North Adams, I highly encourage you to do it. It's phenomenal. It's open to the public. It is absolutely free. You can go in there with your kids, and they can do art projects as many as they want, whenever they want. And it's exposing these young kids who are from, it might not be racially diverse up there as it is in our discussion here today, but there are clearly socioeconomic diversities up there.
Yeah, I think you're so right with accessibility. I mean, just to give you an example, guys, I've been working with the Clay Studio on their move, and what I did was I wrote out all the places that I thought were the most hood places in Philadelphia, and we literally just showed up with a potter's wheel and a generator, and I just started throwing in the park. And then people started watching me for a little bit, and by the end of it, I taught 40 people how to throw. So it's you think about accessibility, we all think of it's got to be this complicated thing where we got to get a grant. Just show up with a damn wheel, you know what I mean? Have people see it, you know what I mean? So, okay, Natalia, you have something?
Yeah,
I see you over there.
I wanted advice, how do you approach these institutions about, having diversity? I went to 3 different institutions, community college, undergrad, and grad school. And the first two were in Miami, Florida, and we had no professors of color. And in Miami, 60% of the population and in the schools are Latinx. So how do you approach these institutions without being labeled difficult or, like creating problems?
Find a friend that doesn't mind being labeled difficult. Support them. That may be the way.
That may be the way.
That may be the way.
Or
if somebody doesn't mind being difficult. If somebody doesn't mind being a big mouth. If somebody support them.
right.
That's what I did. I supported the person who had the political analysis of Marxism that I wasn't going to study. I supported them because they had the guts to get out there on the front end and not do it. So we support artists. I'm supported by my Etsy store to support the girls in Cambodia. So if it's not in you, you know somebody that is. Have a diversity of friends. I told my students, have a friend that's a doctor, a lawyer, an activist, a psychologist, a shrink, and a back doctor. I mean right now. Have all of them in your puddle. Somebody there you support to do it. That's what it is. We have to go back to being a tribe. And everybody in the tribe survived because everybody was working toward the betterment of that tribe. We are one tribe. Everyone in here is human. Every one of us we share.
Right, and I mirror what you say. It's the message. It's as much as the messenger as it is the message. And so, when you're choosing your messenger, to find someone who really does have influence that way, so that people can hear them, because sometimes they're not hearing because of who the messenger is.
I think I agree, and I think that's why. That's okay. I have a lot of speakers.
Okay.
I think that's why in those spaces, I think that I clearly have certain privileges that other people will not. Whether, as you pointed out, privileges that you have, whether it's you're a man, you're a professor, the roles that you hold. And then I'm aware of the privileges that I hold, so that when I'm in those spaces, I utilize my privilege. I think that's my job. Yep. Is to recognize my privileges and then use that, whether that is in speaking to these issues, or it is helping other people have access to the resources that are available to them that they perhaps don't realize that they have access to, or that they have the right to access those resources. But I realize that comes with with that privilege. I think comes my responsibility. But I realize that is part of having privilege. That not everyone has that or feels that they can walk into a space where they perhaps are unseen and voice some of these issues that we were bringing up. But I think to your point as well, Sana, it shouldn't be up to one person. It's not. It's not one person's responsibility. So I think that's a big part of it too, is finding your community and together, the support that comes from that community, and the more voices involved, the stronger it is. And the more range of voices that you have and experiences that you have coming to the table, the more compelling and dynamic and powerful I think it is. It's one thing to say this, I realize it's another thing to take this action.
Yeah, that idea of sort of sharing privileges. I have things that I share with my wife, but she drives. Because when we first met, she was just like, all this stuff that you're talking about getting pulled over, that's not real. She's from Southern Alabama. And, seeing me, face on the floor, being pulled over by cops, just nonstop, Kansas, Alabama, every time, just constantly pulled over, not asked for my ID. She was quickly aware that it's a real thing. And so, unless I'm in a neighborhood where it's mostly Hispanic, my wife drives. And so we share that privilege. And if I go into a bank and they say they're not willing to cash my check, my wife goes in, she's white, and she gets the check cashed. Never fails. So not saying that that's a solution, it's a fucked up product of this world, but it's sort of one of the ways. But I think the way that I've seen it actually work, physically, is in numbers. And so what I would say is if you're passionate about something, maybe you have friends that are not as passionate about it, but are at least willing to stand by your side. So let's say you have a situation, your school's not that diverse. So when I was at Marlborough recently, they were doing the search for a painting professor, and that year we gave away 50 scholarships. So we wound up going from 1 to 6 black students for the whole school, which is huge for us. But every time they interviewed a black person for a job, all 6 people showed up. And you're talking about like a room of 12 people that are showing up for an interview and 6 of them happen to be black. That's fucking pressure. And like if that person was qualified for that job, you know what I mean? If they were the same, they were gonna get that job. And so the point is like when you make it public and you have numbers behind it, like if you're standing, I mean, you don't have to do some like aggressive protest, but like if you notice that your college, like the school I was just talking about, if they don't have any professors at college, if like the 30 artists of color that they have at that school hang outside with poster boards saying like, hey, we want more people of color as professors, all of a sudden next time they hire somebody, it's gonna be like real public. They're gonna know. So I think just like making them have to be accountable through numbers, I think is a really effective tool. So you have a question, and then we have one over here.
I think that and I'm sure most people in this audience, are all on the same page you are with regard to arts and crafts and all of this business and how it does or doesn't inculcate our society. But to me, I think we have a basic issue in that art in this culture, and perhaps even more so in the daily grind of people who are less privileged, since we're talking about privilege, doesn't have a significant place. So it has a huge place in my life because it had a big place in my family's life, and it seems that that's what Sana is saying, and that's what others have said, and Joan has brought up the issue of having a family that supports certain values. But to me, we do have all kinds of arts institutions. You can get into, probably still, if you plan, most museums in New York for free. And but when I go there, I don't see people of color except from Europe. And I guess I don't understand that. Is that a lack of curiosity or interest in art per se? Is it something that's not important to people? Is it something that people feel, and we've heard the exclusion issues, but I know that kids don't get art in school as much as they should, and I'm not sure that a family that's struggling to put food on the table, no matter their color, is going to be focused on the kid getting skills or interest or curiosity around that particular subject matter. So I guess I'm struggling with what more can we do here? How can we get art into families' understanding of what makes us human? How can we get people to come together more about it? And I know that Clay Art Center tries nobly and mightily to do that every day, and does, I think, a pretty good job in a very diverse community. But how can that effort spread?
So that's a good question and an honest one. And I'd love to get everybody else's response to that. So that's a little bit into what we were talking a little bit about, the fact that what we're doing today we might not see immediately, right? Because the truth is that this conversation, would we have a symposium, in the 80s about, specifically about otherness? I don't know, but I know that most likely not. This is like a very contemporary thing to do, and so the fruits of that, I think, are going to be some time later. And so there's a really great article by a scholar named Olivier Goudet, and Olivier Goudet writes about postmodern principles, because people always like to tell you postmodern, yada, yada, and you're like, what does that mean? They tell you, and you leave more confused than you went in. So she decided, like, kids live in this postmodern world, so I'm just going to, like, look at the arts my kids are making, this, in this world, like, instinctively. And so she separated them into categories. And so all these categories were things like the notion of representing, the notion of recontextualization, right? So what I realized is for years I was spending all this time trying to make pottery for people that come from where I come from, like people, things that represented us. And the truth is yeah, I ran into this issue of like, well, they have different set of priorities, right? So why are they going to spend, even if it was $20 on a cup, when they really like need money to eat? So I realized that my sort of effort was in the idea of representing and sort of including them within the discourse of this grander culture. And so what happens is, like for example, right now I have an exhibition that's going to be opening at the Walters Museum. And so I'm in a space that was open, that I'm taking over a solo exhibition in a space that was the home of a secessionist. And all the artwork in there has faces that look just like mine, but it's on antique historic porcelain, right? So what's happening there is that all of a sudden, there's things like Freddie Gray that represents people that come from those neighborhoods, and they have a reason to go, right? And so they see themselves reflected in the makers that are there, and also the people that are being having homage paid to them. And so I think that cumulatively, all the efforts that these folks are making, we're going to see the fruits of. And so I don't think that it's maybe the best assessment is to like go out and see what we have right now, because I think that like, for example, me throwing out in the park, if I do that 100 times, I might get one kid that like pursues that for his career, right? But it doesn't mean that like that 100 times I didn't do it wasn't important. So maybe, do you guys have some thoughts on that too? Like, how do we change that?
Well, I think that using, you know, the institutions of like contemporary museums is not a good place to start, because I think they're problematic in their representation or in their lack of representation. They're not really very accessible anymore. Cost of going to museums, I mean, what is it?
$25.
Yeah, I mean, that's
free at some point of the day.
It's right.
It's just on Friday nights for 2 hours.
It's so.
Kids that are always in the metropolitan, and when you go to the museum at Yale, there are a lot of kids there. I mean, even in my little tiny community of Cortona, there are always busloads of kids going through it, and those children are not paying. I'm not sure.
I think it takes more than that to get children, I think, really interested in not even the idea of being an artist, but just working with their hands, being expressive and creative.
But isn't it an issue of curiosity? Isn't that?
But I think in a way, also, Priscilla, in a way, like you can plant the seeds. So through Clay Art Center, kids went to museum at Yale, right? They just went to Brooklyn, or they're going to Brooklyn. Like, so each of those seeds get planted, and then maybe they'll remember, I went with Clay Art Center, and I'll take my kid. Like, you know, and we will see that further out, but maybe we won't see it today.
Yeah, but I think it's also the narratives that they are brought through in those spaces and even outside of those spaces. And what we've been talking about is, you know, often when, if you don't see yourself in those spaces, or if you see a certain representation of yourself in those spaces that is problematic, well, why do you want to keep going to that space? So I think it's often the narratives that are being conveyed within the museum, within the educational system, and I think those narratives need to change. You know, where many different people see themselves there with equity and agency and possibility. Then perhaps I think that to me presents more possibility and hope. But just to say, well, you know, you bring a kid to a museum, shouldn't that, you know, getting them excited, I think it takes more than that. And I think it's also understanding I think it's also understanding the different experiences that each child is walking in there with. And so their lens is different. And so really understanding the difference of perspective and narrative and history and context and questioning that. And I always ask something I repeatedly say whenever I'm talking or in my talks or in my writing or in my class is, who's in the room and who's not in the room? And why is that? You know?
That's great. I think Joan's going to say here, but I think numbers has a big thing to do with it. Like, I'm just going to make up a statistic, right? Because I'm good at that. So, like, let's say 25% of humans are somehow active in the arts, or somehow willing to be active in the arts, right? So if we say that 25% of white folks are active or interested in the arts, and then we're trying to pursue having more people of color, and then we're exposing 10% of black people to the arts, then we're only going to get 25% of that 10%. So now we're only getting 2.5%. So what's winding happening is like the amount of folks that are actually being exposed to it doesn't mean that everybody you're going to expose to is going to like it, right? So like if the more people you expose to it, the more probability you have of getting those folks interested. It's more of a just human instinctual thing that like not everybody's going to be interested in that, right? So like even if you take a busload of kids there, most of them are going to be on their iPhones, and only 2 of them are actually going to be taking out the work, right? So Joan, do you?
Yeah, I was just going to say. I just recently read an article about how the history of slavery appeared in textbooks. I believe it was in the state of Virginia. And it was a completely irrational approach in terms of calling the enslaved people who came immigrants, as if they had a choice. And so what we have to realize is that the history of exclusion is so long and so deep, where children have not seen themselves in books, and they are not clearly understanding the history, and are not even being taught history correctly. And so when you have hundreds of years layered of this sort of training or, doctrination, thank you, it's going to take a minute for children to then see themselves and to embrace and to go out and explore and do those things. And it's not that it's not happening, but they are being met where they are, hopefully. But it takes a minute for our children to then be comfortable to go into MoMA, or to go into the Metropolitan Museum, or to go into the Guggenheim with an assuredness that they belong there. And it's going to take a minute.
I think also there's a perspective of family, which I think you brought up, Joan. I grew up in a family where my mother was crazy about art, and I spent 90% of my free time as a kid being dragged to museums all over the place. But it didn't interest me then, but when I grew up, I started to look at it differently.
Right.
And I think that context, as you say, is really important. But I wonder if there is a way we can give more of that context to everybody. Certainly people of color, because there's a ton of art that should be able to connect.
So what I want to do, and just so that we can frame what the rest of this time looks like, because we're sort of already over. But so what we're going to do is, Sana, you can respond, and then we have one last comment here. But we're not getting kicked out of here, are we? So this conversation can continue as long as we damn well feel like. But it just doesn't have to be in this sort of, we're on stage and other people are sort of sharing. So Sana, if you can share your thoughts, and then we're going to go right over here.
I don't think that it's a lack of curiosity. I just think what it is sometimes kind of a little bit of fear that nobody in there looks like me, wears the same kind of clothes, or eats the same kind of food. I remember when I worked in the prisons, alternative incarceration, we were doing mosaic tables for Starbucks. And one kid had done a table really beautifully, and I said, well, Starbucks is right downstairs, let's walk it in. And as we began to walk the table into Starbucks, I looked over at him and began to sweat and hyperventilate and get trembling. And I looked over and I said, Johnny, what's wrong? He said, nothing. And then as we got to the door, he jolted his head so that his hoodie came up and completely covered his face. And we walked in the door. I realized then that child felt that Starbucks was an other, and that he had no right to be there. And already the first-time felony, he was frightened. And I felt so bad that I had not, in my years of working with him, made him feel safe, that wherever he was with me, he was safe. So anyway, we walked in with the tables, and people started jumping around the tables. The hood went back, the hood went back, the hood went back, until it completely dropped off. And then one of the girls in the store was Latino, he was Latino, and she ran over and said, here, here's a bunch of fruit, take the fruit. And he went to grab it, and then the hood went back on, because his floor was being set up to steal and be arrested. So still his baggage, his historical family history, permeating his circumstances, is being somebody who came here is nothing. So sometimes you need to see another face, and Fred Wilson's piece, and it was 13 guards. Because if you go, any of these institutions you go to, you'll count more guards, black guards, Latino guards, than you will people. So the thing was, it was stalking for them. That brilliant installation of just the guards. Sometimes you just have to see, and I see it when I travel abroad. All the Americans are at one cafe, all the journeys that I've done. People are looking for sameness, to feel comfortable before they spring from it sometimes.
Yeah, that's real. Like, I remember I was, not to get too far off, but just really quick, I asked this girl out on a date, and she told me where to pick her up, so my parents were dropping off when I was 16 years old, and I noticed that her house had grass, and I began to cry, and I told we were in this neighborhood, this suburban neighborhood, and I told my parents, don't let me out of this car. And she took me, because I didn't feel I was good enough to be able to go into this house. So it's just like this deep, sort of layered sense of otherness and insecurity. So we have one last thought here.
Well, first of all, I wanted to say thank you, Roberto, for your humanity in the way that you presented the panelists, and also including that it's not just an issue of black, but of diversity among a lot of people. Like the exhibition that you put on was about including women, and it isn't just of one particular thing. Secondly, I think this is the most open and honest discussion I have heard ever on this topic, in a way that is so, your stories, every one of you, have given us a perspective that opens us up to another way of thinking. Being chairman of the program committee for the Clay Arts Center, and having worked with Lee and with Adam and with our committee, we really have gone out of our way for years now in trying to bring in the diversity to the Clay Arts Center in a way that we've never really had that much before. So the world is opening up in ways that had not been. I mean, I've been a member of NCCA for 35 years, and this year, for the first time, I have to say, Laura, I have never seen such diversity among the topics, the discussions. True, not the board, but don't forget it was an old boy network years ago when women never even had a chance to get anywhere in terms of that field. So that has opened up. I have to say, for a job position, having just left a position teaching at NYU for 47 years, it was very important for me, not only being chair here of this program committee and making sure that we get diversity in our programming, but at my institution, when they replaced me, that it be a person of diversity. And so for the first time, the job description for the ceramic program at NYU, they had to submit a diversity statement in terms of how they felt about diversity and who they were in order to get the position. And having read some of these, and I had white males call me to say, Judy, do I have a chance for this position? I said, no, you don't have a chance for this position. They really, the deans, the president of the school, the deans are all interested in getting diversity. And NYU, come on, let's face it, is not a very diverse, it used to be called NYU School or whatever, but it was not a very diverse program. But it is now in the art department, I must say, we have Indian, Japanese, and the diversity, 113 people applied for the position of diverse backgrounds. So that is a positive. But I do want to say that from the perspective of the Clay Arts Center, having just been on the board for a short amount of time, 6 years now, we have been trying to get Port Chester community more involved. And I can't tell you, we've had sonic and workshops, and it's amazing how difficult it is. And I don't think it's Priscilla because I have to say that it has to do with money. if we offered programs that were totally free and brought kids not from the museum experience, but actually touching the material and working with the material, there would be a change. It would start from the bottom and it would trickle up. But it takes money. And you know how hard it is from our point of view. We want to expand. We want to get more programming out. But I speak to the community because I shop. I have my hair done here in Port Chester. I shop here in Port Chester. I want to support it. And I speak to the people, the parents, and I say, do they know about the Clay Art Center? Oh no, they just want their kids to learn math and English and read and write and become more gentrified, to become, not to use their art because they don't think that the art is going to get them anywhere. However, all of us sitting here who are privileged, really, when I think about how much one could actually give financially to make programs available free for the community here in Port Chester, I think we would have much more success. But we don't have, we're constantly trying to fundraise and trying to get money to support programs, writing grants. Lee is constantly writing grants. And it's very, very hard. However, I do think things are changing from NYU to these kinds of discussions to, but how, I'm going to ask you, because you're right here in Port Chester, where are the legislators here at this today? Where are the teachers in the Port Chester community? Where are they sitting here? Where are the parents? We've sent out flyers to everybody. Why aren't they here? This was the most, to me, this is the most powerful, wonderful discussion I've ever had on this whole topic, and being part of it has made me even more empowered. Like even the title of this 6 Degrees of Separation, this whole year of programming, the shows, that's me, that it all came from us. And we are really here to make a change. But I don't see us interacting with the community. How can you help us do that?
No pressure.
And we are all doing this. We're doing a job, but we can't do it alone, and there are changes.
Right, and so I believe that Lee and Roberto and Adam would probably want me to say, can we talk about this offline? Because we're already over time. But, we talked about seeing ourselves, right? Being able to see yourself in the institution that you go into. And so I would challenge, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but I would challenge the Clay Arts Center to say, well then look at your board, look at the people who work at the Clay Arts Center. Are they bilingual? Are they
yes,
the community?
We are.
Wonderful.
We are.
So that's a step, but then you need to hold your board accountable in terms of going out into the community to be the representation that you want them to be.
Our community liaison person is fantastic going out and doing what she does.
Though. You have the community liaison person, but you have board members, you're saying to me, correct? So do you push them to go out and to be the spokespeople? Because theoretically, your board are, spokespeople for the organization as well. And so do you utilize them to do that work and to go out into the community and to speak to people?
I'm saying to you that this symposia and the year programming is a product of the board. We are the board. I am the board.
Yes, and that's programming, but is that communicating? And so, again, I'm just saying, are they on the streets? Are they out at the laundromats? Are they are they meeting people where they are to let them know about these events?
Perhaps you might want to come to our board, be on our board, so that you are part of that.
Once again, no pressure.
No pressure.
So I would just maybe it's not specific to Port Chester, but I think that I really believe that it's all in the format. I think this is a great format for the folks that are here, but it's not the appropriate format for people who come from where I come from. So, for example, in Philly we have block parties. I don't know, do you guys have block parties in Portchester? So, for me, I think your money's better spent having a block party, renting out a city block, and just having a bunch of the people that already make art here, making art there, teaching people how to make things for free. I think showing up at a basketball court and taking up a half of a basketball court, and half the people are throwing pottery on one side, and the other side they're throwing half the side they're throwing pottery, the other side they're playing basketball. It's like if things are visually integrated and people see things as fun. Like the other day when I showed up, no one questioned why there's a random pottery wheel in the middle of the park. Everybody was just like, I just know I want to do it. And there was like an 80-year-old man I was teaching. There was like a 4-year-old. There was a little girl who had no fingers, who I taught how to throw pottery, and no one questioned it. So I think it's a matter of like the format, and just like when we say meeting people where they are, not just like thinking about that and then making it for us, like the way that we're used to doing it. It's like literally figuring out what people are into. Like where I'm from, all the young men are playing basketball at night. So it's like, well, if I want to hang out with these guys, I got to set up a part of that court where we're making pottery, and they can choose whether to come hang out with me, or they can choose to like keep doing their thing. But I can assure you that 25% random number that I just made up earlier, they're going to come over the potter's wheel. So I think it's some of those sort of ideas that will help.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right, guys.
Thank you, everybody.
So the gallery is open for a bit, so we can head over there if you want. Otherwise, thank you so much for coming.
Yeah,
I know. I thought about that. I heard you thinking that. I heard you thinking that.
My sister's home, so she said she could roast it.
Okay.
I mean, yeah, but like,
I love Missy House. It sounds like a first world.
I know, right? My rose. But the rose.
When are you driving back to New York?
I know, it's really
I know,
good.
we're shocked that
I know. I mean, I mentioned it.
Oh yeah, you can turn it off. Thank you.